I want to be clear, I'm not going to talk about watershed analysis. It was interesting when I was asked to do this talk 6 months ago. I didn't, a title was given to me and I said, sure, that sounds great. And I started working on this talk and I thought, my God, if I propose another round of watershed analysis, I'll probably be hung before I can get out of the room. So what I want to do is actually look at an integrated watershed framework, okay? I mean, not because we can't afford to go through the detailed watershed analysis that occurred after the Northwest Forest Plan. And I think what we need to do is recognize that and just admit it up front. Nonetheless, I think we can do a really good job at helping us understand about where we can do things, what the potential implications are, and use that to move ourselves down the road. Okay, so if we think about where we've been, prior to the Northwest Forest Plan, we were talking about riparian buffers that were basically, in the best of cases, were 100 feet on the each side of a perennial stream. And that, the real riparian issues at that time were really focused around the fish people primarily, although the other aquatic organisms were also being considered. But it was really a somewhat narrowly focused area and area of concern, a narrow range of concerns. We moved to the Northwest Forest Plan buffers, and it wasn't just, this was on federal land, but I think it also expanded how the buffers or riparian areas were thought about on non-federal lands as well. And it became a much more complicated discussion in some ways, and because all of a sudden we were interacting with people in various disciplines and areas of interest that in a lot of cases aquatic people hadn't dealt with before, and it became it was very interesting how this whole thing evolved. And I want to talk about what I think was one of the major stumbling blocks in this, and something that we seldom talk about, but something that we need to deal with if we were really going to move forward with this issue. This whole idea of what is integrated, what does it mean to be integrated in terms of watershed analysis or some type of framework? And I would say we've had a real difficult time doing this, because if initially, as watershed analysis was conceived in the Northwest Forest Plan, it was all down at the one end of the pink tower with the aquatic types. But it became, as Marty pointed out, it quickly became a much bigger issue than just the aquatic type, because a number of other organisms all of a sudden came into play because of the extent of the riparian reserve network. And that meant we had people with different worldviews starting to enter into discussions and conversations and trying to figure out things that really hadn't happened before. And I think that's led to some real interesting problems. If we think about the non-aquatic types, our terrestrial counterparts, they've got this concept of the world that built around this idea of succession. And I think the key part here is right here. Things are continuously changing with time. And that means both biologically and physically, they recognize that there are changes, and associated with this are going to be different things that are going to happen. And when they look at the world, they see the world as a series of patches, large scales that change and move about the landscape. Now contrast that with what the paradigms that shape our thinking about the aquatic environment. Now it's interesting, in sitting here the past 2 days, how many times we've heard the word dynamics and so on and so forth about aquatic systems, but what does that really mean? If we look at the paradigms that shape our thinking, one of them is the river continuum concept, and basically what that's talking about are changes from the upper parts of the network to the lower parts of the network, both in terms of the biological features, various processes that go on, and potentially the physical features. Conversely, we've got other things, these classification systems. The Rosgan system, as the example shown here. But what we don't have is the concept of time built into aquatic systems. And as a consequence, we end up looking at the world like this. And people say, oh, no, we don't. And I will challenge that. Because think about what we have. When we talk about aquatic ecosystems, what we do is we have this vision of a system that's supposed to have so many pieces of wood and so many pools and so on and so forth. And that's our vision of what a healthy ecosystem is. You know, we have these things called properly functioning conditions, whatever you want to call it, we've got it. And you think about, you know, how Dave Rodkin makes his money. He's got this classification system. He says, okay, this is an F1, 2, 3 floodplain or something, and it's supposed to have these characteristics, and if he doesn't, what do? You hire him, he gets his bulldozer, he goes out there and he makes it look like that. Conversely, we have, you know, if we don't have 3 pieces of wood in the channel, we want to put 3 pieces of wood in the channel because that's our ideal vision. So there's a basic disconnect between the aquatic types and the terrestrial, our terrestrial counterparts that we seldom ever talk about. And I think it really it is insightful to start thinking about this because it gives some answers as to why we have this tension between when we talk about a lot of our forest management. Okay, now there are a few, I should say there's some recent, not recent papers, this is actually one that we depended on heavily in the Northwest Forest Plan where we talked about dynamics, from 1992 by Bob Nyman and others, that talked about system as being dynamic. And it was all parts of, you know, I mean, parts of the network are dynamic. We've got the headwaters, we've seen a lot of examples of that here today. But it's also the middle portions of the network. And in fact, if you look at if we were to be able to look at systems, we would see that these are probably the most dynamic parts of the whole network because of the influx, the impact of the types of events that happen in these headwaters affect these middle portions of the network. And this is where we tend to want, most of our activities as federal land managers are going to be. And yet we try to treat this as a static entity. And I think that's where we've got to start talking and looking at things differently, and hopefully it can make some suggestions as how we do that down the road. The other thing, in looking at some of the basic assumptions, this is a cartoon that was in the Oregonian during the Gang of Four in 1991. And it was when, you know, when fish first showed up on the scene. And the assumption is that, you know, if we have old growth forests, we'll have healthy fish populations and healthy habitat for fish. I think we're starting to see that may not necessarily be true. Pete showed some examples, you know, made an allusion to that. And I think in his study, there's a number of other studies that are starting to really question this basic premise. And yet when we talk about thinning, when we talk about forest management activities, everything is geared toward we want to get old growth. We need old growth conditions. And is that really what we want to be doing? I think we've got to ask ourselves those very questions. You know, we've gone out and looked at old growth streams. Well, if you go out and look at old growth streams in the Coast Range, and this is one that's roughly 300 years, has a stand of 300 years and older in it, I would contend this isn't very good for fish. It's got lots of wood for sure, but it doesn't have much in terms of substrate and sediments, okay? So we've got to step back and ask ourselves some really sound questions. And this is just an example of how we've been trying to approach the problem, looking at the range of conditions that streams experienced in the Coast Range, going from recently disturbed systems, and these are ones that had fires in them and then hill slope failures, where you've got lots of sediment and very little wood, at least wood exposed, to something intermediate that's got a combination of wood, sediment, and pools in it, to these old growth systems. And so as we talk about thinning and we talk about our goals for thinning, and particularly with regard to the aquatic environment, I think we should not be focusing on old growth, but we ought to be talking about these mid-successional conditions. How do we get those back present on the landscape? So how do we move forward? Particularly move forward in a way that when everybody's not pointing in different directions that they showed in the original slide. Okay, so we've got to have a framework, okay? And I would say these are the basic components that we want to look at. We're going to have to consider multiple organisms, and we can't get away from it. You know, we can hide in our own little disciplinary holes if we want, but reality is things have changed. And because, you know, you think about the riparian network, when it was along the fish-bearing streams, it was probably about 10% of the network was there. We've expanded the riparian ecosystem boundaries by about tenfold in the Coast Range. So there's not many places on the landscape where we don't have overlap with other disciplines. We're going to have to consider the impact of proposed actions at a range of scales, and probably at the site scale and maybe the watershed scale, and we do this. And we want to consider it over time, because one of the things I'll show here in a second, and I think we've seen some of the illustration, particularly yesterday, is that there may be short-term gains that we want to take advantage of or manage the forest for. Even though in the long term we may not get as much wood or as many big trees as we're after. And most importantly, I think we've got to start looking at the context of the various places where these actions are proposed. Every place can't do everything all of the time. You know, we can't have we're not going to have owls everywhere on the landscape. We're not going to have old growth forest everywhere on the landscape, and we should be able to recognize that and articulate it. And what we should be doing is managing in the context of what the ecological potential of a piece of ground is. And it's going to have to be relatively quick. We can't spend, you know, months and months and years trying to do these analyses. It's going to have to be something that we can do. And we're going to have to do it, I think, admittedly, in the face of incomplete knowledge. We're just going to have to acknowledge that there's going to be some risks of unknowns. There's going to be some places where, you know, there's going to be some winners and some losers. And we need to be able to articulate those things in a way that people can understand it. What are the features it's going to be? As I said, it's going to have to be comprehensive. It's going to have to be as thorough and as thorough as we can with some acknowledgement of it. It's going to have to be inexpensive. Again, we don't have the luxury of having, you know, after the Northwest Forest Plan, how we had all that money for watershed analysis. We're not going to see those days again. We're going to have to do this on the cheap. And again, to reiterate, it's going to have to be done quickly. So what are some of the things we might want to consider? Well, I think there's some really good examples that were shown today as we start talking about where we're going to go to do activities, what type of things we want to do in the risk. And Dan Miller talked about this. If we're looking at thinning as an option for increasing large trees, I would say what we have to be looking at here is with regard to the where we want to go to get wood back in the channels. Okay, the dark lines here are where we have the primary source of the wood are going to be from the stream adjacent forest, and we would do, we could look at what we did here. And conversely, when we get to the red areas, it's not going to be necessarily, those areas are not going to be where we're going to get stream adjacent sources of the wood. They're going to come from the debris flows. So our actions need to be geared up top to the small headwater streams. And we need to be thinking strategically about how, where we want to place our actions and what we want to do to achieve these results. And then it's Kelly, I just stole a slide from Kelly here, is that we want to begin to match these things up with the high intrinsic potential, because we're not going to be able to do everything everywhere at the same time. We're going to have to be, again, strategic in where we go. And looking where we get the biggest bang for the buck. And you can imagine if we're looking at where we want to improve conditions for fish down in the short term, these are the places on the landscape where we want to be able to go. And you can imagine that also, what that means is there's other options. There may be, every place doesn't have to produce fish. It may be that there's other places that people can go to achieve the goals for wildlife and other attributes. Things like another issue, and really I know that these are aquatic sort of centric slide, but just to illustrate what I'm trying to get at this variation that we have to begin to get at. Every place isn't going to warm up equally. We contend, well, we can't do thinning because we're going to warm streams up. Well, there are going to be some places that certainly that could be true, as shown here. In a lot of other parts of the network, thinning may not actually have negative attributes negative effects on water temperatures. And so we need to recognize this type of thing, and that we can start to have maybe wider latitude to do things in these parts of the network than we do in others. And what this is all coming to is that we need to look at the landscape in a way that we can maximize the benefits for a wide range of species. This is an example we worked on, and we're going to try to expand on for some other issues. Looking at this is a watershed in Northern California, and most of the primary fish production is occurring in a relatively small part of the watershed. To argue about buffers and thinning in other parts of this network and the effect on fish, maybe it could be there, but the risk is probably relatively low. We could start to look at other options here and maybe thinking about focusing efforts up here for the non-fish, for other wildlife type of attributes. But it's looking at the world in a way that we haven't done, I would suggest haven't done much, done in a way before. The other thing we need to be thinking about is what we use as references. I mean, right now, we tend to use old growth as what we're trying to achieve. And this is a slide I got from Tom Spees and Rob Paft. And their point being is these are all areas that have old growth like conditions, and they cover a wide range of standard types. And so when we're talking about what we want to achieve and using some reference as a way of assessing impact, we need to be really careful that we use an appropriate reference, because these can vary widely. Okay, and finally, I really think it's important about, when we think about the potential impact. Oftentimes when we're doing this, particularly depending on models to look at impact, what we end up is looking at way at the end and say, okay, well, here's an unthinned stand and we're going to lose some number of big trees over 100 years. But conversely, what we could do is say, you know what, maybe in 60 years with thinning, we're going to see a relatively big gain in the number of potential snags that are available to this system. And for species that are on the edge and whose habitat, who are just hanging on, we may want to think about the trade-offs of saying, well, you know what, I'll take that gain in 60 years and maybe take the risk that this impact is not as significant as we want to contend it. So we need to be looking at the output of models, not just at the endpoint, but looking at what happens along the way through time and assessing our options there. Okay, so what are the barriers, okay, to moving forward with this? I would say right now, as I emphasized in the beginning, our paradigms and the difference in the paradigms that we all bring to the table really limit the types of options and our assessments of conditions, and we need to move on from that. We heard yesterday about public perception. I would think that because of this static view of aquatic, particularly it's really strong for aquatic ecosystem, that the public shares this idea that everything should be good everywhere all the time, perception of streams in aquatic environments. And that's a real impediment to try to moving, I mean, it's an impediment on the terrestrial side for sure, but it's a major impediment in looking at other options and alternatives for moving forward. And again, on the aquatic side, there's a number of current policies and laws that I think we really need to step back and ask ourselves, are they really ecologically relevant, and are we applying the results or thinking about the impact of them correctly? One of them being the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act right now requires that everything be drinkable, swimmable, and whatever elseable at some point in time. We allow no variation. And I can't imagine if somebody wasn't around with a 403D list 200 years ago that there wouldn't have been streams on them. Now that's not to say we should go willy-nilly just doing things, but it's something that we need to think about in terms of the implication. And the same with our whole assessment of cumulative effects. So there's a number of different things I think that we need to look at moving forward. And I think the most difficult part, and particularly because I truly believe that systems are dynamic, is our education process of the public. These are the headlines after the 1996 flood. And everybody, it was a disaster. But ultimately, when you think about what we're doing, we're managing these landscapes because these streams and these systems are really shaped by these periodic large-scale events. And those are what really make the system productive and the landscape productive down the road. And without these, and without being able to at least imitate these type of things, I think we're going to see that we'll actually see a long-term decline in the productivity of much of our landscape, and ultimately the failure of our policies. So with that, any questions or comments? Good. Oh, good.
Thank you.
Okay.
I got one quick one for you, Gordy.
Okay.
You showed the picture of the old growth forest with the bedrock, and you'd rather have the mid-cirral or mid-successional target. And I'm kind of wondering if what you really mean is that you're talking not about forest mid-successional, but an aquatic disturbance system. You mean mid-successional since the last debris torrent or debris torrent deposition, not really mid-cirral in the forest succession standpoint. And it's mighty important to clarify that so that we're not trying to disturb forests and manage them back to a mature condition, even though that's not exactly what the aquatic goal is.
Yeah, okay, I was using mid-successional in terms of the age of the vegetation that was present in those watersheds. But what we ultimately need to be thinking about is that our goal is really to have old, we talk about old growth streams. I mean, that's what we use as a reference for either evaluating effects or in terms of trying to determine restoration goals. And I would contend that what we really need to be doing is thinking of that maybe streams in old growth forest are not what we should be striving for. And if we have old growth forest, we're likely to have streams that are going to be in similar conditions. And so I guess I think I'm going to disagree with you there, Doug, in terms of it's still streams that are associated with those mid-successional forests at some, say in a period of 80 to 120 or 130 years from a major disturbance.
But don't you have, the disturbance event that creates that mid-cirral aquatic habitat, the disturbance event might have happened far away and it deposited in an old growth forest. I mean, they're spatially discontinuous sometimes. Another thing I want to point out is that the way I understand the Northwest Forest Plan is that we're building the structures that natural processes can act upon to create high quality habitat.
Right.
And so right now we have a whole bunch of little structures out there, and we want to have more bigger structures. And we shouldn't be necessarily trying to set things back, but advancing things towards larger structures.
And I'm assuming you say larger structures, the larger trees. And I agree. One of the things is where are we going to get those larger trees from, and how do we get them? And so that would be that would be the debate we would have to have.